I am Reverend T. I am the unrefined priest. I forgive him probably the most powerful words that can be spoken from one human being to another human being. We all know that forgiveness is not easy. And we all know that to receive forgiveness is the ultimate gift that we can be given, not just from God, the creator of the universe, but from one another as well, particularly when the stakes are so high, when you're talking about life and death, when you're talking about someone who took the life of somebody that is very dear to you, to be able to stand up there and say, I forgive you. I mean, that's powerful. That is an absolute beautiful thing to witness. Now, I do want to give credit where credit is due. MSNBC, which I guess they're still going by here, did a good job on this. When they're addressing the memorial service of Charlie Kirk, I thought that they did a fair job, fairer than most, to be honest, and I was stunned by this. But Joe Scarborough is going to lead a panel here, and I thought they brought up some really good things in here. There are some things that I want to address, just kind of clean up, and one of them is the difference between Donald Trump's speech and Erika Kirk's speech. I do want to jump into that, but let me play this clip first, and then we'll jump in.
That's NBC's Garrett Haake with that report. David French, you and I actually grew up in this sort of cultural background. We attended, I don't know exactly what church services you attended, but I suspect they were a lot like mine. And so none of this sounded foreign to us. It was certainly interesting, though, the mix of religion, politics, and as Donald Trump himself said, sort of this old-time tent revival feel. I was curious and been curious. What were your thoughts? Of course, moving beyond just the absolute horrible human tragedy of all of this, and still, I must say, all these weeks later, still so extraordinarily hard to come to terms with that somebody going around talking to college students would be assassinated this way.
Yeah, you know, when you saw Erika Kirk speak, one of the first things that I thought was, this is one of the most beautiful things that I've seen, heartbreaking, heartrending. And that's what Christianity is what she did right there in front of all of those people, actually forgiving Charlie Kirk's killer, talking about the sacrifice of Jesus and Jesus forgiving his killers. I mean, this is the heart and the core of what Christianity is, and to see it right there in that way. And I think it also helped bring home to people that we're having political arguments and political fights surrounding all of this, but at the end of the day, she lost a husband, her kids lost a father, people lost a friend. I mean, this was a horrific, horrific event. And so I think that moment was singularly powerful in communicating the gravity of the loss and also what Christianity is. But then you had all of this complexity of Trump getting up there and behaving in a very, very, very different way, also to cheers. And so what you saw here in a lot of ways was this complexity of this MAGA world. And
all right, so this is what I want to talk about a little bit. First of all, there is a difference between Erika Kirk and Donald Trump. And you can see the difference in the speeches that they gave. Erika Kirk is a committed Christian and has been for a very long time. She is mature in the faith. She knows Jesus, she knows the Bible, and she knows what Jesus has called her to do. That's not to diminish the fact that she forgave her Charlie Kirk's assassin. That's very, very hard to do. But it is understandable that would happen. I actually expected her to do this. Not because it's easy, but because that's the kind of Christian that Charlie Kirk was. And that's the kind of Christian that Erika Kirk is. Now, when you factor in Donald Trump and you look at his speech and why it's so different because Donald Trump is not where Erika Kirk is. He's not a mature Christian who knows his Bible and has grown up in Christ. I think, even the most diehard supporters of Donald Trump would admit that at the very base, his faith is very new. Maybe it's growing, you could say. Now, I know that people will push back on that and they'll say, no, there's no faith. He's not a Christian. Look, I'm not judging people on where they're at with Jesus. That is between them and Jesus. And if Donald Trump tells me he's a Christian, I believe he's a Christian. But there is a difference in maturity of faith that you can clearly see in Erika Kirk from Donald Trump, not just in this instance, but just throughout. And you saw it in the speeches that they gave. Erika Trump is like, yes, I forgive him. Now, again, not easy, but she was able to get to that point. And the difference between Donald Trump standing up there saying, I hate my enemies, I can't get where she is. Well, at least there's some honesty there. Because he's not where she's at. So the world is trying to figure out, how do you hold these two things together? It just comes down to maturity of faith. It just comes down to someone who has grown up in Christ and somebody who hasn't. And that's not to say anything bad either way. It's just they're in different places. They're in different places in their faith. So let's keep going.
The complexity of this MAGA movement, that there are people within it and people who express ideas within it who they're beautiful, wonderful people who are caught up in this movement. And then there is this other side that is so directly contradictory of the message that Erika Kirk shared. And so that's one thing that struck me.
Yeah. He's 100% correct. In the MAGA movement, there are all sorts of people. What I think people fail to realize is that in every movement, there are a whole bunch of people in there with different agendas, different reasons why they're attached to that movement. Even if you just went over to the left side of the Democrats, what you'll find is that there are all sorts of different people in that movement. Some of them are there because they support LGBTQ issues. Some of them are there because they fight for abortion. Some of them are there because they're atheists and they're pushing back against Christianity. There's a whole bunch of people in that movement, just like there's a whole bunch of people in MAGA. They don't all fit the same mold, and you clearly see that. I don't think that any of this is stunning. I think that this is conversations that we need to have to realize the diversity of people. And so it's a good conversation to have.
When I watch this, I know from my own home in Tennessee, where people have just been cut to the core by Charlie Kirk's loss. And I think you could see that. You could see that in the memorial. And then you could also see this other side of it all when Donald Trump got up to speak, when Donald Trump started to address the issue. And, that is in many ways the complexity of all this that we saw in front of our eyes.
Well, it really was. I mean, there were so many times that we would hear things that, again, sounded like it could come straight out of Baptist Student Union in Tuscaloosa when I would go there in college, or the Baptist churches I grew up in. They're talking about love and grace and forgiveness, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us. But then with at least the politicians, John.
Let me just say, most of us on the right, I don't know, most of us, a lot of us on the right are in that camp. And part of the problem is that what the media has done is you have basically labeled us as Nazis. This is a rare moment where you're seeing MSNBC or CNN, being very honest with the fact that there are a variety of people in MAGA that are supportive of Donald Trump and the right. And guess what? They're not all there because they're Nazis. Are there some Nazis? Yeah, but for the most part, the vast majority of people that are over here, we're about grace. We're about love. We're about gathering up the people and being Christians. That's what you find on the right. And so to have MSNBC speak in these terms is nice. I wish they would do it more often, because what you see more often is they're all Nazis. They all hate, everybody. That's not what it's about. It's about ideas. And so in Christianity, there are a lot of people who are part of Donald Trump's group because of people like Charlie Kirk. Because people had a strong faith and were committed to biblical principles. And so using these broad labels is not helpful. And I'm glad to see it here, but it's not the norm. The norm is we just throw out these broad categories and we try and lump people in there. So let's keep going.
You had another beat. It was, Charlie taught us to forgive, but, and then it'd be like, oh, this is all the left wing's fault, or oh, these are people who hated and mocked and ridiculed. There were two beats, and it did sound, when the politicians got up there, sounded very discordant instead of celebration of a life and talking about Jesus's words and Jesus's commandments of us to forgive others. There at times there was another tone that was taken. So I found that to be discordant. But I'm curious what you certainly could go back to the early 1800s, John, and find examples of politics and religion mixing. So this has happened before. I'm just curious, what were your thoughts yesterday as you watched this?
What I was thinking was it would be too glib, and I think there are going to be a lot of folks, I would imagine, on the center and left of American politics who will be reflexively uncomfortable with what unfolded yesterday. What I would urge is not to be reflexively uncomfortable, but to take each of those who addressed that audience, addressed the nation, addressed in many cases the world, and take their words on their own merits and in their own context. There's going to be a lot of talk. I'm sure David's email box is full of people seeking to understand this thing called Christian nationalism. But there was a feeling, particularly with Mrs. Kirk, that it was something that had a genuine, what appeared to be a genuinely religious component. And then came the president, who spoke the way President Trump speaks, and that should be considered on its merits as well. But I'm a big believer, as I think you are, Joe, that we must separate church and state. There's a religious case for that, by the way. Originally, that notion of a wall of separation between church and state, which was an image that came from Richard Hooker, an Anglican divine, came through Thomas Jefferson, and then the Supreme Court picked the image up in the 20th century. The initial point of the wall was not to protect the state from the church, but the church from the state. The original.
All right, let me just pause right there. First of all, anybody who's going to bring up Richard Hooker, as an Anglican priest myself, you're in good graces with me. I love Richard Hooker. But one of the things that he's bringing up is separation of church and state, which you don't hear very often, was to protect the church from the state and not necessarily the other way around. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't want to protect the state from the church as well, but the real danger was, is, and has always been the state overstepping the church. And this is what he's bringing up, is that it was to protect the garden of the church from the state and not the other way around. We have flipped that, but that's an interesting idea.
Phrase was that the garden of Christ's church should not be damaged by the state. That said, religion and politics, because they're both about people, they're both about human nature, they're both about our sense of the origins, course, and destiny of life. Religion and politics can't be separated. They have to be managed and marshaled.
All right, that's a really important point right there, because there's a lot of people that are like, look, we got to separate religion from politics. You can't. It's impossible to separate religion from politics, because I'll just ask you this. Is biblical marriage, is that a political issue or is that a religious issue? The truth is that it's both. So we're wrestling with what marriage looks like in the United States on a political scale, but marriage itself was it was the first institution that God established, and God defined what marriage is. So you can't say that it's political. It's religious. It's deeply religious as well. It's both, and you can't separate them. And if you go through the number of topics that are both religious and political, it's most of them. And so you can't separate these things. So I'm really glad that they brought that out as well.
And so what we have here is, I think, particularly in the moment where Mrs. Kirk, in imitation of Christ, forgave the assassin. The only other example of that I can think of offhand in public life is when John Paul II visited his own assailant, which is a remarkable analogy and standard. Mm-hmm. I don't dismiss this, I would say to my liberal friends who might be uncomfortable with some of the imagery. There are worse things than...
I absolutely love this. First of all, bring up John Paul II, also a very powerful image of a mature Christian being able to stand in that place and say, I forgive them. Again, some of the most powerful words you will ever hear somebody say to you and that you can say to somebody else. But for him to say, don't dismiss what's taking place. There are worse things that can be happening. There are worse things than Christianity entering into politics. There really are, because when real Christianity gets in there, you will see a revival, and you will see love and grace and mercy. Those things are just associated with who Jesus was and what he called us to be. So I absolutely love this. I think there's one more point that I need to bring up here before I get going.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, and I will say, David French, it was, and again, Pope John Paul II did that. We actually talked to Reverend Al Sharpton, who was stabbed in an assassination attempt. He forgave his assailant. That's a command from Jesus, and we saw it again yesterday with Erika. But I will say, no, I will tell you, most of what I heard yesterday, David, was very affirming. And there were even people who got up who surprised me in what they said, talking about we're not to judge others. We're to focus on ourselves. We are to heal ourselves. We are to become better ourselves. It reminds me where Jesus says, the Sermon on the Mount, why are you looking in the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a plank in your own? Take care of yourself. So no, I thought until the politicians and the people who work for politicians got up there and tried to leverage it for their own good, I thought those who knew Charlie Kirk and loved Charlie Kirk and worshiped with Charlie Kirk and grew up with Charlie Kirk and lived with Charlie Kirk, I thought their messages were very affirming and straight out of the Gospels. I always talk about the red letters. You know, don't take me back to Nahum. Don't take me back to some singular verse in Leviticus. Like, look at the red letters. See what.
All right, this is a pet peeve of mine, where people create a canon within a canon, and so you have the biblical canon, which is 66 books. What Joe Scarborough is bringing up here is that I only really care about what Jesus said. What's fascinating about that is that we fail to realize that Jesus didn't write any of the books of the Bible. And so they are recounting the words of Jesus. And those words of Jesus are inspired by God to be written down, just as all the other words that are not in red. And so to discount the rest of the Bible and say, I only care about the words that are in red, is to create a canon within the canon. And that is not true Christianity, and it's very problematic. Jesus went back to the Old Testament all the time. He's quoting the Old Testament all the time because he understood the power and the importance of the Old Testament. To discount that is not right. So I did want to point that out. The last thing I wanted to say is, Joe Scarborough said, most of what I heard was affirming. And I didn't hear that from a lot of the people on the left. So I do applaud this entire panel and Joe Scarborough for leading this conversation. I thought the conversation was for the most part really, really good and accurate. And so props to MSNBC on this one. I don't usually say that, but they did a great job here. And again, the last thing that I just want to remind you is there's a difference between Erika Kirk and Donald Trump. And the difference is maturity of faith. The difference is that where they are in their faith journey, and Erika Kirk is a mature Christian who has made it her purpose to be a follower of Jesus Christ. And Donald Trump just isn't there. Will he get there someday? Maybe, I hope, I pray, but he's not there now. And that's the difference between the two speeches. My name is Reverend T. I am the Unrefined Priest. If you like what I'm doing, hit that like button as well as the subscribe button, and I will catch you on the next.